Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and this is the first video of many in a series of Bobby Fischer's USA Championship games to cover the upcoming graphic novel Bobby Fischer, The Knight Who Killed Kings. Now this comes to us from 1963, in my opinion the most dominant performance of any US Championship series. Bobby Fischer played 11 games and he won all 11 games, and he literally just destroyed everyone that got in his path. What's interesting to me is nowadays, once you even get close to getting crowned champion, if you're maybe up a point or two as far as the final standings, most people will tend to play for draws. They don't want to lose even that half a point. The games don't really tend to be that exciting to me, but Bobby Fischer, he won by 3.5 points, and even till the end he tried to win every single game. So he was 11 for 11. In this particular game he played against Larry Evans. Now another reason I think this game is so fantastic is only 2 years earlier, again this is 1963, in 1961 Bobby Fischer released the article Bust to the King's Gambit. Now that article was it came out in the American Chess Quarterly, which is a chess magazine that's edited by none other than Larry Evans. So Bobby Fischer not only knew how Larry Evans played, but he also knew that he edited the magazine that published the Bust to the King's Gambit, which is Bobby Fischer's, if you're not too familiar with it, is an article that he wrote after he lost to Spassky, who played the King's Gambit and beat Bobby Fischer. He pretty much said the King's Gambit is flawed. Now, keep in mind that in particular in his article he did go over the pawn to e4, pawn e5, and after pawn to f4 in the exchange, knight comes to f3. Now in the actual game that he plays today in Larry Evans that we're going to be covering, he does play a different move. He plays bishop to c4, but it's very interesting to note that even at the end of the Bust to the King's Gambit that Bobby Fischer talked about, he said even if white tries a different move, in this case bishop to c4, he said that he will only lose differently. So he pretty much wrote an article saying that the King's Gambit is flawed. He's now playing an opponent in the 1963 US Championship that he knows is very familiar with that, and he decides to play that opening against him, which I think is phenomenal, mostly just because I think it's kind of a slap in the face, basically just saying, I know I'm better than you, I'm going to play an opening that we both know is inferior, that you should win, and I'm still going to beat you because I'm Bobby Fischer and I'm better than you at chess. So we'll go ahead and get into it. It does start with pawn e4, pawn e5, pawn f4. Again, this is the King's Gambit line, and Larry Evans playing the black pieces decided to capture and accept, and he takes here on f4. Now from here Bobby Fischer had two ideas he could have gone with. He did have the most common, which is knight to f3, trying to control the center of the board. Later on he can castle on the king side, put his rook on the semi-open file for the f file, but he actually decided to play bishop to c4. This is his favorited variation for the King's Gambit accepted line, really putting a lot of pressure on this f7 square, and he was also very comfortable, which many people are not, after the queen comes down to h4, forcing the king here to come to f1. White no longer has the ability to castle, so it takes someone very skilled to be able to play in this situation, knowing that his king is not going to have the safety that it would after he would have played knight to f3. From here, Larry Evans plays pawn to d6, a very common move from black in the King's Gambit line, whether it's accepted or not, really allowing this light square bishop to get involved into the game. Also for black, he has to keep in mind what is he going to be attacking. This white king here on f1, it's going to be really hard for him to come to the queen side. He's going to be somewhat weak on the king side, so black, if he really could, he would like to, he already has his major piece out here on h4. He would really like to get his light square bishop. He'd also like to get his knight here on b8 developed, and he would like to castle on the queen side and then start to focus all of his energy and all of his pieces attacking the king here on the king side for white. From here, Bobby Fischer developed his knight to c3. Again, simple development move from Bobby Fischer, trying to control the center of the board here, especially these light squares, especially this d5 square. And Larry Evans played bishop to e6. Now, I do want to touch on this because so many chess players, anytime they see a piece that they can exchange, they do so automatically, and then they just try to get to an endgame, and they really don't start to think about strategy. If you look at this before Larry Evans plays bishop to e6, Bobby Fischer has a distinct lead in development, meaning that he has these two minor pieces trying to control the center of the board, and Black is coming from behind as far as development. Now, he is up in material. He does have this pawn here on f4, but Larry Evans is really going to try to come back as far as a development standpoint. If he were to come to e6 and Bobby Fischer right away exchanges, after Larry Evans takes back, he can always bring this pawn to e5, solidifying that pawn chain, really controlling the dark squares in the center of the board. And as you can see here, Bobby Fischer no longer has that control of the center that he did before. He now is allowing, Larry Evans to have both of his center pawns involved into the game. He'd really like to keep some pressure here from a piece on c4. So instead of exchanging right away, he decides the best move is to play queen to e2, meaning if Larry Evans wanted to exchange right away, let's say bishop takes on c4, then after the exchange back on c4 with the queen capturing, then the queen is still very active and Bobby Fischer still has that lead in development. Larry Evans only has one pawn in the center of the board, and Bobby Fischer has a much better game here. So obviously Bobby Fischer makes very, very accurate decisions on his chessboard. But even in your own game, make sure that you're not jumping to conclusions, you're not trying to exchange as quick as you can, but instead you're really trying to figure out what's going to be best. Would it even be better if they captured my piece first and then I recaptured with another piece? Now from here, Larry Evans plays pawn to c6. One of his other options that he could have played is knight to d7, getting ready to castle on the queen side, which is going to come inevitably later on into the game. So he plays pawn to c6, and white plays knight to f3. Eventually this was bound to come, developing again another minor piece into the game and gaining a tempo here. The black queen on h4 is going to have to get kicked back, and so again Bobby Fischer is down in material, but he's going to lead substantially as far as a development standpoint. Now the queen's going to come back to e7. Probably would have been a little bit more aggressive if he would have come back to h6, but he does decide to come back to e7. He is still ahead in material, but Bobby Fischer presses on. He knows that he has a lead in development. Anytime you have a lead in development, you want to continue to push forward. You don't want to stay back and play passive, because then your entire advantage starts to fall apart. So he plays pawn to d4. Again, that's about as aggressive pushing forward as you can get. And from here, black plays bishop takes on c4. Again, trying to take away some of the pressure that Bobby Fischer's putting in the middle, taking away this bishop here on c4. As we talked about before, Bobby Fischer can now recapture with his queen on c4. Now, as you can see with this move from pawn to d4, he also has allowed this dark square bishop here to have a discovered attack on this pawn on f4, looking to regain that material back that he lost at the beginning. So if you can think about it, if Bobby Fischer has a distinct advantage in development, if he can gain back the material that he lost early on, he's going to have a very, very good game. So black really has two options here. One's bad, and we'll go over, and then one's a little bit better. He would like to hold on to this material on f4. Now, a lot of times people would look at it and say, why doesn't he play b5? Well, two main reasons. One, also keep in mind that he does want to castle on the queen side, and then really start to attack the white king on the king side. But this will also be a mistake, because after the knight takes on b5, white's going to have a hard problem if he captures here back on b5 with his pawn. Then white can now play queen to d5, and black's going to lose a lot of material. If he tries to, defend his rook, bringing his knight out, he's going to lose his knight. There's no way for him to defend this rook here on a8, unless, again, he wants to lose another piece, bringing his queen to b7. So this would actually be a mistake. Again, not only will he lose material, but he's also weakening his queen side here. The really only good move that he has here is to play pawn to g5. Again, we're not really too worried about in this situation. Larry Evans doesn't matter if he weakens his king side, because again he's looking to castle on the king side, or excuse me, on the queen side. Now from here, white's going to continue with pawn to e5. Again, really starting to push forward and put a lot of pressure on Larry Evans. Now Larry Evans decides to decline this, which I think is a better move. If he would have exchanged, a lead in development with open spaces against Bobby Fischer, you just really don't want to do it. But he decides to solidify his pawn chain a little bit, play pawn to d5, decline the exchange, and really start to look towards an endgame here. This queen side is now very solidified. He can now start to really work on the king side of the board. So Bobby Fischer, his queen is being attacked, so he brings it back to d3. Probably the most aggressive square. He doesn't want to be too passive with where he moves this. But again, he doesn't want to move it back to, let's say, b3. He realizes that there's not going to be a lot of activity that he can actually do on the queen side. So he pretty much knows that Larry Evans needs to come to the king side. And that's really what's opening up right now. So since he has a lead in development, he might as well start to shift his focus onto the king side. Since the queen side's pretty much locked up here, once this pawn chain has been locked down with this pawn move to d5 here. Now, Black decides to get his knight involved into the game. He plays knight to a6. Again, really looking to bounce this queen off the board. Personally, I think he should have geared towards moving it towards the king side. But in this situation, I don't think it's too bad. Later on, he can really, start to get his knight to c7. He definitely wants to get that involved into the game earlier than not, or he's going to have this knight hanging out here on a6 while all the action's going on the king side. So from here, white plays knight to e2. Now, if you look at it, what can Bobby Fischer do? It's not going to do a lot of good to bring his bishop here to d2. Again, a king move isn't going to do too much. His rook here on h1, his rook here on a1 aren't doing too much. His queen can't really do too much, so really wants to start focusing on the king side. His knight here on c3 can't really do anything on the queen side, so that's why he plays knight to e2, really looking towards attacking here on the king side. Now, Larry Evans, we talked about before, he plays knight to b4, trying to kick this queen here away, and Bobby Fischer just retreats back to d1. Again, still a little bit passive. He could have always played, queen to c3 or queen to b3. But again, I think Bobby Fischer realized that he really wanted to focus on the king side. There's no reason to extend your queen over to b3, c3. It's just going to be, away from the action when everything goes down on the king side. So he does move his queen back to d1. As we would expect, Larry Evans decides to castle on the queen side, and now Bobby Fischer plays pawn to c3. He really wants to go ahead and kick this knight away. Right now it's just kind of a nuisance. There's really only one square for him to go, and he kicks it back to a6. Now, Larry Evans really, later on will want to get this to c7, but right now it's kind of an in-between move to play pawn to c3. Just kick it away because it was kind of a nuisance just hanging out there on b4. Now Bobby Fischer can continue with his plan. He's going to play pawn to h4. It would be a mistake here if Black actually took, because then Bobby Fischer could come in and play, rook takes on h4, and then he's going to gain this material back here on f4. But instead, Larry Evans decides to play the better move, and that's just to continue to push forward, starts to put a lot of pressure on Bobby Fischer, and play pawn to g4, kicking this knight away. Bobby Fischer decides to play this knight back to h2. Later on, he could have always played it to e1 if he wanted to, but decided in this case to play h2, still putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on g4. Now from here, Larry Evans played pawn to h5, solidifying this pawn here on g4 if he wanted to do anything with it later on, and Bobby Fischer takes back with his knight here on f4. So as far as material, if we look at it, both sides are definitely equal in material. As far as both of their sides, I would call it about equal, simply because White definitely leads in development, but his king is also a lot more susceptible to any sort of kingside attack. And the king for Black is pretty comfortable. He's castled queenside. It's going to be very difficult for White anytime soon to come over and attack this king and put any sort of pressure on the Black king. Now from here, I actually feel like Larry Evans made a mistake. In the game, he played queen takes on h4, and while he does immediately look like he does gain material. As we'll look at it, he actually does not. And so because of that, I think it actually would have been better for him to play something a little bit safer. He could have played, queen to d7. He could have started to develop his other pieces. He could have played bishop to g7 if he wanted to. He could have started focusing on knight to c7, but instead he really started to overextend himself, and Bobby Fischer just took absolute control of that and started to, again, put a lot of pressure on Black, and Black really didn't have a lot of control after this move. So again, Larry Evans plays queen to h4, and Bobby Fischer plays king to g1. Now he does this merely because, one, he wants to protect it behind this g2 pawn, but more importantly, once he moves this knight here from h2, we have a discovered attack. The rook is now attacking the queen, and he wants to have a defender, and the most logical piece in this situation is the king there on g1. So just keep that in mind. The knight here is threatening. He could come to f1 if he wanted to. He could come to f3. All of these attacking the queen. He could even come here and attack here on g4 if he wanted to. Again, all of these attacking the queen here on h4. From here, Black decided to play knight to h6. Again, trying to defend this pawn here on g4. And Bobby Fischer just simply plays knight back to f1. Again, discovered attack on this queen on h4. Larry Evans is forced to retreat, and he plays back with queen to e7, kind of where he was before he captured on h4. Bobby Fischer can now take back the material with knight takes on h5. And again, Bobby Fischer, as far as development standpoint, is doing much better. Black has both of his knights on the rim. He has them both on the A file and the H file. Typically not what you want to do. You want to have your knights more centralized or more active. As far as, this knight here on h5 is a lot more active for white here. Also, he is yet to, his bishop here on f8 is not doing much. It's going to be a lot easier for white to get his pieces involved into the game than black. Black doesn't have a lot of threats that he has, where white does have a lot of threats, where he's still threatening all these pieces. He does have this great outpost. He can come to f6 if he wants to. At any time, he's threatening with his dark square bishop, and he does have all these semi-open files and this long open file that he can attack with very easily. But from here, Black plays rook to g8, and Bobby Fischer plays knight to g3. Bobby Fischer, one of the greatest thing that he does in his chess games is all of his pieces work together. So all of his knights always work together. He does have, this rook here on h1 defending this knight. All of his pieces really do work together. From here, Larry Evans plays rook to g6, and Bobby Fischer plays knight to f4, attacking this rook, making it go somewhere, and it just comes down to g5. Now, keep in mind after this next move, because Bobby Fischer plays bishop to e3, again, one of the things you always want to think about is have your minor pieces attack, and you want to have your major pieces defend and support those early on into the game. Later down the road, you want your major pieces doing a lot of the attacking if you still have them, but very important to have your minor pieces kind of out in front and then your major pieces to support them. So the last piece that, as far as development, that Bobby Fischer had to do was bring his bishop to e3, the most aggressive square he can do, and then later on he's going to bring his queen to d2, again trying to support all of his pieces. Larry Evans now plays knight to c7. I particularly think this is a little late. I would have liked to see Larry Evans play this much earlier. I think the knight here is a little late getting to the party. I think it would have been better if he played, pawn to f6, trying to break up the center of the board, really start to get his other pieces involved into the game. But nonetheless, he plays knight to c7, and Bobby Fischer plays queen to d2, as we talked about. Now, not only is he supporting this, he's also threatening, knight to d5. He does have the discovered attack against the rook there on g5. He's also allowing his rook, if he wants to come over into the game. He does have this semi-open file for f. So a lot of threats that Bobby Fischer has just by playing his queen to d2, having his major pieces support his minor pieces here. Now, Larry Evans decided to bring his rook back to g8. Again, he saw that discovered attack and decided to go ahead and opt out and move that. From here, Bobby Fischer plays knight to e2. As we talked about before, all of his pieces work together, so he still has both of his knights supporting each other, but also he has more discovered attack. So he now has 3 different pieces eyeing down on this h6 square, and it's going to be very, very difficult for this knight here on h6 to live through the end of the game, particularly because there's not many squares for him to go to. He can't come to f5, he'll die. He can't come to g4, there's a piece. He can't go to g8, there's a piece. And he can't come to f7 because there is a piece. Larry Evans now decides to play f6. Again, trying to break up the center of the board. He realizes he would like to bring his knight back to f7, but he realizes that there's not enough time to do that. Bobby Fischer goes ahead and gobbles that up, and after the queen takes here on f6, he comes down and captures with his bishop here on h6. Now again, there's not many great things that Larry Evans could do in this situation. He could always exchange pieces here with his bishop on h6. And then, Bobby Fischer could recapture with his queen or his rook here from h1 to h6. He decides instead, even though he is down in material, to go ahead and bring his bishop to d6. Centralize it, try to get some sort of counterplay. He knows he's down, he needs to make something happen. Bobby Fischer now plays rook to f1. Anytime you have an advantage, go ahead and get your last piece involved into the game, and do it with tempo. So attacking this queen, forcing the queen to move somewhere. Again, all of his pieces are defended, minus this queen on d2, which can't really get to anyway. So all of his pieces really, really working well together. The queen's forced to come back to e6, and now Bobby Fischer plays bishop to f4. Again, he doesn't really mind now, exchanging these bishops here on the dark squares. And Larry Evans decides, instead of exchanging, to go ahead and bring his rook to e8. Bobby Fischer now brings his rook to h6. As we talked about before, he does have all this support from the bishop here on f4 and the queen here on d2. Now he's really starting to get a lot more active and starts to put a lot more pressure on Larry Evans and the king side here. So Larry Evans decides to go ahead and capture there on f4. Now, it would actually be a mistake if Bobby Fischer decided to, take the queen here on e6, because after, Larry Evans comes down and captures here on d2, then after the exchange here on e8, both sides are actually equals. You can look at material, both sides are equal. So Bobby Fischer definitely has to be careful about how he captures, but instead he definitely chooses the right way. After Larry Evans decides and takes on f4, he decides not to take the queen right away. There's no need. He just captures with his queen here on f4. Again, still maintaining a lot of pressure. All of his pieces still working very, very well together, and just kind of waiting till the end of the game because he is up so much in material. Now really there's not much for Larry Evans to do. He does bring his queen back to e7. Bobby Fischer now plays rook to f6. Now this is kind of the end of the game, and Bobby Fischer realizes that he's already won. If you've ever been taught or had chess lessons, one of the things you always say is you always want your rook, your queen, and your rook to be on the same file, and you would actually want them to be in this order. Rook, queen, rook, as far as how you have them on the file. But actually, I think he missed a move here. I think that knight to f5 was actually a stronger move. It's attacking the queen there on e7. The next move he does have is knight to d6. Again, forking one of the rooks on e8, gaining more material. Now, I know it doesn't really matter. He's going to win the game either way. He's up an entire piece, which anytime Bobby Fischer's up an entire piece, he's probably going to win. But I do think this was a small inaccuracy, not that it really mattered, because he, again, was on autopilot. He kind of knew he was going to win. But just something to think about. Even the best players, even when they're winning, don't always play the best move. So think about all the different options that you have in your own game. But Bobby Fischer played rook to f6, and Larry Evans plays knight to e6. Kind of a last-ditch effort. Bobby Fischer plays queen to e5, and then the knight, comes down to g5. And now it's kind of over from here. Bobby Fischer is now allowed to exchange pieces off. There's not much that Larry Evans can do here. If you're up in material, you definitely want to trade down, because the more you trade down, the bigger of an advantage that you do have. So Bobby Fischer decides, what, I'm just going to exchange off. He can now bring his his rook to f8, and after the exchange here on f8, Larry Evans decides to resign to the game. He's just down too much material, and there's just not enough material on the board for any sort of counterattack or to do anything, any threatening to Bobby Fischer. So a fantastic game, one of the most dominant U.S. Championship performances that we've ever seen, going 11-4-11, trying to win every single game if you're playing white or black. Just phenomenal, and I think it's just fun that he did play the King's Gambit against Larry Evans, who knows so much about the King's Gambit and the bust to the King's Gambit that Bobby Fischer wrote. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. Again, this is one of the videos in the series that we're going to be doing on the U.S. Championship for Bobby Fischer. So definitely check out those in the future, and let me know your feedback, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.